Good morning, everyone. It is 9:03 and welcome to Human Rights Training for Child Welfare Professionals. I was giving a few minutes just for other people to join us, so I do want to thank you for all being here today and for signing up. Just like I put in the waiting room, please make sure that you did sign the consent form. You wouldn't be able to be in the Zoom room unless you signed the consent form that gave you a link to this waiting room. Everyone's camera is off. That's how I allowed it to be. However, if you are going to use an avatar and want to put in the chat that you're going to use an avatar, then I could also open a camera, but I will be leaving all cameras off at this moment because this is being recorded. And as the consent form indicated, change of name and no description of anyone, so you all could be anonymous, is what we are going to do today. This is going to be uploaded. This training is going to be uploaded, this recording, into a human rights YouTube channel for others to see in the near future. And this is why it's important that no information is provided while we're doing this training. So we're going to jump right in here, and I am going to have my screen up. I'm going to try to make it a little bit smaller because it's taking up the whole entire screen, but we will see if we could do that. If not, we would just have to work how it goes. My name is Beatrice Drace, and I am a Doctor of Social Work candidate for the Monmouth University. And this is my last year with plans of completing my program by the May of 2025. I want to thank you for being here today, as this is really important study, and we're going to talk about that our entire time. The first question I do have for everyone prior to us starting is just one question. How many of you child welfare professionals have taken any form of human rights training during your undergraduate or graduate, or even as working as child welfare professionals? I'll wait a few minutes. Thank you so much. This training should conclude within 45 minutes to 55 minutes. I put an hour and 15 minutes because part of this training is that there is a a survey question, and then there's six open-ended questions that I will be asking all of you at the end. This will be used to collect data and reference to this study itself, and did it have an impact after we completed. Just to give a little bit of background of myself, again, my name is Beatrice Drace, but everyone calls me Betty. I have been working as a child welfare professional for over 23 years. I started as an investigator intake worker from 2002 to 2010. From 2009, 2010, I was a provisional supervisor. So what does that mean? That means that when other people will go on leave, I will become a supervisor for either 5 months, 6 months, 7 months. And just to, it gave me an opportunity to see, do I want to be a supervisor? Because that's a different responsibility than just being a staff member working on for myself. I did enjoy being a supervisor. I'm really connected with the team itself. So in 2010, I became a permanent supervisor into the year of 2017. Although I was not directly as an investigator from 2010, 2017, I was what we called, because I'm from New Jersey, is a SPRU worker. And that's a special response unit that will work after hours, holidays, when there's emergency closing, and on weekends. So I did that for pretty much like, if I was there for 15 years, pretty much like 14 years, I was a SPRU worker. So I've always stayed in connection with the field and with families directly. So I want to welcome you to the Human Rights Child Welfare Professional, and this is Becoming a Human Rights Defender. This training preview, we want to explore the vital role of human rights in child welfare. In this session, we will introduce key human rights principles and demonstrate how they can guide your work, our work, with families. We are going to look at two real-world scenarios because, as I indicated, I come from this world. So I was able to use the scenarios that pretty much resonated with human rights, but I did change names to protect the families, as we all do, right? We're going to get ready to, learn some new skills, look at some tools, and it's just a way for us to advocate for the dignity, equity, and injustice for every child and family that we come across, right? It indicates that many of you did not take human rights trainings, either an undergraduate or a graduate. To be honest, I did not learn about human rights training until 2012 when I started my master's program. And during that time, it's when I came across human rights articles. It's because I had to write a paper and the professor asked about human rights articles, and it was my first time even reading it. And I was kind of surprised because I've been in the field for 10 years at that moment that I really never learned about human rights. So, this is some other questions for us. Prior to coming to this course today, how many of us thought about human rights as we're working with our families? And it's just a yes or no in the chat. In case you want to come off mic, that is fine as well. But if you want to put in the chat, how many of us thought of it? And to be honest, I never did because I didn't know about it when I was working in here. Um, yeah, and we're going to talk in reference to how can this training really help us in our career. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So our learning objectives today is going to be summarizing our the disproportionality in child welfare. We're going to identify the role of child welfare professionals and human rights defenders. And then we're going to talk about identifying and applying some strategies using human rights principles. Disproportionality in the child welfare system. And really quick in the chat, if someone could just write down, all of you guys could write down, when did you learn about disproportionality? Is that something that you learned once you started working for child welfare agencies? Did you know it prior to working here, or did you learn this in either graduate school, or did you learn it later on in your career? And I'm not going to read the description for you. You could take a few minutes just to read that. But why is it important for us in the child welfare system to talk about this? We have to talk about the history of child welfare. And we know that for years now, it's not something that happened this year. It's not something that happened last year. It's been happening since the beginning of child welfare. What they find is that there's a history of disproportionality, surveilling and intervening in Black families. Many factors contribute to that. One of them being poverty, structural racism, social economic factors, and often misinterpreted as neglect. It has led to higher reports and removals. We know that implicit bias impacts our Black families. They're more likely to be investigated and have their children placed in foster care rather than receiving preventative services. And what's the consequences of this is disproportionality. It creates more of foster care placements. It creates more family separations in the Black families. And we also know that it creates long-term trauma, right? Black children in foster care are less likely to be reunified with their families and more likely to age out without permanent placement. And this is something that is research after research, something that you could do your own research and to look at that. But I question all of us here, and I started doing this my last years prior to leaving my investigative role was I started marking down. I just had this notebook at my office and I would write down how many families were coming in and where were the families from, what areas, environmental, race, and if the family had history with child welfare. So I started collecting my own little data just to see, are we servicing more of the Black and Brown community versus other communities? And I just started looking at that from a different lens later on in my career. And I ask all of you here to do the same thing now that you're working with families, to write it down for your own data, for your own knowledge, and for you to get a better understanding of the system itself. And I think that's really important as we work in this system itself. African American children are significantly overrepresented in the child welfare system. According to the ACF, New Jersey had the highest disparity rate in placing African American children compared to white children. I mean, if you really think about it, although African American children only make up 15% of the child population, they account for 22% of those children in foster care. And we see over and over what are the contributing factors that is leading to this. We know that it's poverty. We know that systemic inequities within communities. We know that racial bias exists in decision-making process. We know that institutional challenges within the child welfare agencies, but the outcomes are very clear. These factors lead to child abuse and reports and more child protective services investigations against African American families. And what does it also bring? It brings trauma, right? We all have heard of it. We could never really sit here for myself, from my own experience, for me doing this for 15 years, of having a child thank me for removing them. And I think I've experienced that only one time in my career. And when the child said, I mean, this is after the fourth or fifth removal, but the child just looked over to me and just said, my parents are incapable of taking care of me. I could no longer return there. That was an odd thing that has happened in my career. And I ask everyone here to think about that. How many times have our families, or even specifically our children, has thanked us for removing them from a situation? We've all been there where some horrible situations where we know that we did the right thing. And I am here to say that we are doing a great job, but we could always do better when we know better. Um, and there's another thing that I want you to write down as a child welfare professional. How many times are children thanking us for removing them from their families? Because my experience have been that they want this to be temporarily. They want this to be where we are helping the families and they want to return to their families, but not something that is for long term. That we understand that trauma occurs when we remove children, and the longer that they stay in the child welfare system and the foster care system, the fewer opportunities they get to be unified with families, right? And we know that so many of our cases lead to that way. So just take a few minutes just to look at this graph. I feel like when we talk about 14% or 22%, sometimes a graph really helps us understand to really look at it overall, right? So if you see here, African American children make up only 14% of the total US population, but represent here in this graph 23%. And the numbers change from 21 to 22, 22% to 23%. But this indicates a significant disparity in child welfare involvement. As you can see here, white children make up 50% of the child population, but 44% of those in foster care show a slight underrepresentation, as are the Hispanic children, and that's in the graph in the red, are 25% of the child population, and 21% of foster are also slightly underrepresented. Other racial groups show a relative balanced representation, but when we look at the African American children, our Black children, we see an overrepresentation. And this just to give you a better understanding when we look at graphs, because sometimes by just looking at percentages, it doesn't give us the whole entire number. But this is something to really think about as we're doing our job with our families. So part of this training is to talk about human rights. And just to take a few minutes where you could read what is human rights. And I know that many of you have shared here that you did not have human rights training, either in undergraduate. I think one or two of you indicated graduate schools when you learned human rights, but many of you indicated that you did not learn this or have learned this currently in the training that you're getting at your child welfare agency, which I understand. I worked for the child welfare training facility in New Jersey itself. And I got to say that New Jersey is definitely A little bit more advanced than other child welfare agencies, as in our training. I've had many anti-racism trainings itself, and I know that more work is coming down the pipeline. So New Jersey is understanding that something has to be done. And the question I always go back and say is that we're doing so much in New Jersey, but if you remember two or three slides before, New Jersey still has the highest. So this makes me think about what are we missing here in New Jersey that's not covering what is needed, because Black children, African American children are still overrepresented in the child welfare system. And if I just indicated that New Jersey is an advance compared to other child welfare agencies, what are we missing, right? What are we missing? You know, human rights are the fundamental birthright of every individual without exception, right? There is no reason for not to have your human rights. You know, first codified in the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was established in 1948, and rooted in centuries of human civilization. You know, over 20 principles of United Nations conventions have further defined and expanded these rights. And it's a reference to our protections. You know, some conventions address specific abuses in reference to tortures, genocide, while others safeguard vulnerable groups, refugees, women, children, people with disabilities, our vulnerable population, our marginalized population. You know, the human rights framework is a dynamic, constantly interpreted as context and understanding evolving of the human rights itself. So during this training, we're going to cover a few of the principles of human rights, right? Because there's so many of them that we're not going to have time within this time frame of the hour and 15 minutes that is slated for this training. But I just wanted to bring your attention to a couple key concepts. I am going to be dropping in the chat some resources for everyone just to have it. And it's just pretty much all of the articles for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm also going to drop some links in reference to other human rights articles that I think it's really important as child welfare professionals for us not to know it 100%. I can't sit here and tell you that I know all of them word by word, but I am very familiar with most of the articles because I've been studying this for the last few years and really, really making it an important aspect in my life. And not only because I work as a child welfare professional, but how I treat people moving forward. And we're going to talk about some of the research that I found later on. The other one that we're going to cover is the Convention of Elimination of All Forms of Race Discrimination. And you're going to hear me saying CERD. So it's CERD as we move forward. And these are just other two articles that we're going to cover as we look at some scenarios. So just take a few minutes just to read this. And I'm trying to make this a little bit smaller, but it's not allowing me. So I do apologize for that. So I'll take a few minutes and I'll read it just in case the screen itself is blocked for you. A worker at a local food pantry calls a Child Protective Service hotline to report a family experiencing homelessness. The family includes a single mother, Maria, and her two young children, ages 5 and 8. The family has been staying in their care for the past week, relying on the food pantry for meals. Maria lost her job 2 months ago and has been unable to secure stable housing. The worker is concerned about the children's health and well-being as temperatures are dropping and the family's living conditions are unsafe. The question to everyone here is, how can the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be used to guide decision-making in this scenario? And as I said, I know that many of us indicated here that we've never had training or any classes in reference to human rights. So I am going to walk you through that in our next scenario. So how can we apply the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Child welfare professionals can embrace a human rights perspective by recognizing how systemic failures, rather than the individual shortcomings, often contribute to a family's challenges. Using the principle of the UDHR as a foundation, professionals like ourselves can focus on ensuring families like Maria's receive equitable treatment and support to uphold their fundamental rights, particularly in areas such as housing, education, and freedom from racial discrimination. From a human rights perspective, professionals can see how the system may have failed in her children instead of attributing blame to Maria. This shift in perspective emphasizes the need for systemic accountability and equitable intervention. So when we think about the articles of human rights itself, when we're talking to Maria or anyone else, we think about all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, right? We know that Article 25 talks about the right to a standard of living of adequate and health and well-being. Everyone's entitled to access fundamental resources like nutritious food, clean water, suitable clothing, and adequate housing to maintain a dignified life. Recognizing that Maria and her children deserve and respect a non-discriminatory treatment, ensuring that Maria and her children are treated as individuals with inherent dignity and not as a case number or a burden. Advocating for services that empower Maria rather than stigmatize her for her circumstances. And if we think about that, if our approach is to be what happened, how did this occur, and not coming from an approach of having any kind of opinions, and this all really, if you really think about it, when we talk about homelessness, I know that currently homelessness is one of the biggest issues happening right now in child welfare professionals, where constant phone calls are happening because of because of homelessness. And there's just not enough housing to place so many people. But if we think about it, when we look at it, we shouldn't be looking at it as an individual in reference to Maria did anything to cause her homelessness, right? That's something that we do look into to make sure, is there anything else going on that causes? And if there's not anything else that caused this, then we know that society itself has failed Maria for not providing what she deserves under our Article 25, where they all should have adequate standard of living. All human beings deserve that. And it's just looking at it from that kind of lens, from that human rights kind of lens, and coming from that approach versus is what did Maria do to cause this, in reference to what has others or society has done that caused this standard of this way of living for Maria and her children. And I just think it's just shifting our mindset of how we're working with our families. Take a few minutes here and I'll read the both scenarios as well. Michael is an African-American father, is raising his two young sons, Jamel and Sean, ages 10 and 7, following the death of their mother. A school counselor files a report with Child Welfare Services after noticing that Jamel frequently appears tired in class and has been late several times. During the subsequent investigation, Michael explains that he works long hours at a warehouse and faces challenges with consistent transportation for his children to go to school. Despite his efforts to provide a stable and loving home, the caseworker reports and labels Michael as disorganized and raises doubts about his parenting abilities, right? As a result, Michael is mandated to attend parenting classes and comply with a frequent monitoring to retain custody of his children. So when I say retain custody of his children, it indicated that removal was done due to the mere fact of whatever happened in this investigation. These children were removed from Michael. Now we're going to take scenario number 2, and I'll read that out loud as well. John, a Caucasian father, is also raising his two children, Emily, 10, and Ryan, 7, while juggling long hours and limited resources. A school counselor files a report with the Child Welfare Services after observing that Emily has been late to school multiple times and occasionally appears very tired. During the investigation, John explained that his demanding work schedule makes it difficult to manage consistent transportation for his children. Rather than questioning his parenting abilities, the Child Welfare Agency provides John with referrals to a local child care services and transportation's assistance program to help address the issue. And I want you to really think about that because when we think about these scenarios, and even as I was writing the scenarios for this training, I said, oh, we don't do that. There's no way that we do that. There's no way that this is happening. But really take a look back. And as I said, I was here for 15 years, and these scenarios come from experience in the field for myself and having pretty much the same makeup of the family, same kind of concerns coming into the hotline. But the only difference was the race of the family and how some families were provided services while other families' children were removed. And we really have to take a step back to say, how is this happening now in 2025? But hearing the stories, knowing that the data is out there, these are the kind of things that we have to take a step back and saying, how can we make a difference? How can we do this, right? Because both phone calls came in pretty much looking the same, but the outcomes were very different for these two families. And we have to think about there's definitely more behind the scenes, there's more information that we're not privy to because we're just looking at the overall information that was brought in to the hotline itself. But if we think about it, we've had our own situations, we had our own cases where we have stepped back and said, things look different for these two families. What is going on? Now, if we take that approach and start looking at it from the lens of a human rights principles, we'll see how can we have done this differently with the families. Using objective tools and guidelines to assess cases without allowing personal biases or stereotypes to influence our decisions. Ensuring that similar cases receive similar interventions regardless race of the families that are involved. How can we do that as child welfare professionals? We could definitely advocate for anti-biases policies. We could make sure that if a supervisor is giving us information about one family and they look the same, but giving us information about another family or recommendations how to proceed with a family, and the only difference we see in our role is the race of the family, is that we start advocating for these families and start calling out what is happening in the situations. We have to support policies within the agency that require supervisors to review cases for consistencies and equity. We have to push for regular racial equities, audits to identify addresses and disparities in the outcomes that we're seeing in our families. And we have to understand that it is our role to also push back. And I know that is easier said than done, especially I guess I'm coming from a place because I was a supervisor prior to leaving. But also when I was a staff member, I would definitely question many of the supervisors that I had when I felt that there was an injustice going on in the family. And I would bring it to their attention because I believe that once you're in this child welfare agency for many years, sometimes you lose sight in reference to the calls that we're making. And sometimes it just takes a couple of us just to bring it back to their attention and saying, hey, I just want to put something out there. It appears that we had the same situation with a different family, and the only difference I'm seeing is that one family was African American, the other family was not, but the outcomes and the recommendations that I'm hearing sound a little bit different, just for us to have that better understanding of how can we do things differently at this agency, how can we do things differently in our role, right? Because we cannot control others, but we can control our own role and how we're looking at things, but also showing up as human rights defenders and advocating for our families. And at times might be a little bit uncomfortable to go back and push back to our supervisors and say, I'm not agreeing with this decision. I feel like there's something going on. Is it possible to speak to someone else? In New Jersey, it's usually a supervisor and then there's a child casework supervisor. But from other states, I am not sure how the chain of command is done at your agency. But I think we should get to that place of us feeling comfortable or uncomfortable, maybe bringing things to their attention, because at times that does not really happen, and we will continue creating these disproportionality if we do not question when things are said to us, that we in our stomach, we get that gut feeling that something is not right here. So take a few minutes just to read this. So I ask all of you here, what does it mean to be a human rights defender in our work? We have to consider that all of us as child welfare professionals, we have a unique opportunity to champion human rights. Like, who else has this opportunity to meet with families, especially our marginalized families, our vulnerable population that we come in contact on an everyday basis? And what do I mean about human rights defender? I mean, it's upholding and promoting human rights in every interaction with children and families, advocating for equitable, respectful. Our role is to ensure that every family is treated with dignity and fairness, and not only by supporting our families in crisis, but also by working to transform policies and practices that foster inequality. you know, we have to, our role is to call it out, to call out systemic racism, because it has and will continue to lead to overrepresentation of Black and Brown families in the child welfare system. Not only we must recognize biases, but we must challenge those biases that were indicated before in both our individual practice, but also looking at others, looking at ourselves. And at times, we know that this does not come from a bad place, but also at times comes from our own experience. And for many of us, and I speak for myself, is why I got into this career, is because there were some things that happened in my childhood that I said to myself, no other child should experience this, or no other family should experience this. And we want to make sure that we are protecting, right? Our main job is to protect children, but I also want us to include protecting families as well. We understand that we don't negotiate when it comes to children's safety, and I'm not asking you to turn a blind eye to the safety of the children. What I'm asking is to include families in that protection as well. It is our role to advocate for policies grounded in human rights and to ensure that the decisions are made without prejudice. We must encourage our colleagues, our direct supervisors, and even our direct local office managers or area directors, if you're from Jersey, or from your higher leadership that you work directly with, to consider how their daily actions can reduce discriminatory practices in our system. So I will leave you with this. I challenge you all to consider how you can integrate human rights principles into your daily work. Remember that each and one of us child welfare professionals can contribute to a fairer child welfare system and help dismantle systemic racism and look at our families from a lens of a human rights principles, not only from their actions of what's going on. Again, we don't negotiate when it comes to child safety, but if we could just maybe put on that human rights lens when we're working with our families, then that is how we, all of us here, become human rights defenders. So I'm going to just pause here just to see if there's any questions. These are one of the tools or resources that I'm going to be dropping in the chat as we move forward here. Just to take a few minutes if there's any questions as I proceed. And I will be pausing the recording just in case we want to have some more conversations. Now, and well, I could sit there and say that human rights, and somebody indicated human rights is not law. No, there is no law saying that you must do these things, right? But I always go back and I say, I don't need human rights to be a law. per se, to do the right thing, if that makes sense. I do not need it to be a law to treat people with kindness or fairness. No, so I don't it doesn't need to be an exact law as somebody asked a question, but I say to everyone here, and I believe that all of us think about this when we're going out working with our families. I treat families the way I would like my family to be treated if they got a knock on the door. And I think all of us here might have heard at one time, we are a phone call away from getting someone coming knocking at our door. And how would we want someone to show up and treat our family if the shoes were reversed? And that's what I always indicate to everyone here. I see another question. Okay, the question is, why isn't human rights being taught at colleges? I was a social work major and I didn't get these classes or training. And yes, so I'll talk a little bit about my studies. So what I found in my studies was that many schools of social work were not training students in human rights. I have seen a shift since I started my study where a lot of undergraduate schools are doing many classes now. There is this pilot program out of Stony Brook College. I think it's in New York. And they're starting a whole entire human rights courses for undergraduates. I have seen many human rights discipline or interventions coming in at graduate schools as well, something that is being taught. At Monmouth University right now, we have a human rights leader, and that is our doctorate program for social workers itself, and it's mostly on human rights. But what I found in my study was that many schools and many social work students, many BSWs, did not learn about human rights, nor did they even hear about it until graduate school. So that is something that is growing. And I maybe in a couple of years, you could go back and look at the research and that might have a shift, but you're absolutely right. Not something that you learned if you were a BSW or MSW. Yeah, absolutely. So I see another question. Why isn't this a training for child welfare professionals? In the child welfare system? Good question. As I said, many states, I could only talk for New Jersey, are doing a really good job of bringing many anti-racism trainings currently. However, what it's showing is that many of those trainings, many of those classes, and we're still overrepresented in African American children are still overrepresented in the child welfare system. So what else is missing? And this is what led me to this capstone project, was because I saw that there's so many trainings on anti-racism, but still here we are. So why not introduce human rights? And just to add to that, my study has shown that in Australia, there were two studies, right? There was a study on child welfare professionals and the attorneys representing child welfare professionals. They took a whole entire class on human rights. But when they went to court, the attorneys refused to apply the human rights principles in their courtroom. And what the child welfare professionals, the investigators, the permanency workers indicated was that they thought if the attorneys did use the human rights principles in their courtroom, it would have made a difference. So that study pretty much showed that the human rights training didn't work, but we know that that wasn't 100% because the human rights principles were not used inside the courtroom. Now, there was another study out of Australia, and this was done by a nonprofit organization, and they did an actual study. They trained human rights trainings to child welfare professionals, and what they found was that child welfare professionals started treating families in Australia, and that's the native families of Australia, which is overrepresented in the child welfare systems. There was a shift on how they were treating them, and there's also a shift in them coming into the child welfare system and into the foster care system. So that study itself gave me a little bit of hope that training human rights to child welfare professionals could have an impact on how we are treating families, but in particularly our African American families. So that is what my study found in reference to this. Now, I think that this is not a one-time training. I think that this should be a mandated training, and I believe that this should be an ongoing conversation where not only training itself, but when we go back and we talk to our supervisors, when we receive a referral on a family, having our human rights principles in the forefront as we are discussing our next steps of working with our families, and also being educators to our family, like which I did many times when I met with my families, giving them an opportunities to training them while I was there investigating them. But I think us bringing to them their human rights and allowing them to understand their rights as well, I think it's something that should be part of all of our roles, because the goal is for us to lift our families, to provide tools and skills, and to leave them better before we walked in there. So, and after we walk in there, right, or after we leave, is to give them an opportunity to better themselves, become better versions of their own family, so they don't have to be revolving doors to the child welfare system. Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, to want to be respectful of your time, I believe it's now 9:43. I am going to be dropping now in the link itself the two links to the Microsoft Forms, and that is for the post and pre-question post questions that I have for everyone here. So that is what I'm going to be doing at this moment. So give me 1 second. So I'm going to pause the recording. Give me 1 second. So these are the two links to the Microsoft itself, Forms. So these are the two forms. So you could just click on those links. It's not going to ask you to sign in. This all is anonymous. So just take a few minutes just to fill those out. I will be able to see once you completed it. So just take a few minutes there. And I will be here just if you have any questions for me, and I'll wait for that as well. So I want to say thank you very much for everyone. I'm going to stop the recording now, just to give you guys a few minutes to complete that as well. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to show you the reference to some of my references here. It is not an exhaustive list. It will be too much to show everyone here. Thank you so much for all of you who have already completed the open-ended questions and the 5 other questions. So thank you so much. And I really, really honestly want to say that you all are amazing people for being in this profession. I applaud all of you every day for what you do. This is not an easy task. This is not an easy job. It is not an easy career, and it's just not for everyone. So I do thank you all for this opportunities, for sharing your Sunday morning with me. Please, you have my information. Please reach out. If you ever need anything, definitely want to make sure that I am supportive to everyone and happy to share more resources. And I just say continue on this journey of becoming human rights defenders. It's all of us could do it at all of us could do it. We don't need all these degrees to do it. I think it comes from a good place. It's learning a little bit about all of the principles that are covered under human rights, and just doing the right thing, the integrity, doing the right thing when no one else is looking at you. So again, thank you, and I applaud you all, and have a wonderful, wonderful Sunday. And that's for you. Thank you.